Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. As Herbert said, I am part owner of the Sophisticate's Tea with my wife Trinity, and today we are going to be discussing with you some trends, cutting trends in the coffee and tea world. I named this speech today Beyond Beverages because one of our main goals is to try to get you to start thinking about tea and coffee in a different way other than just simply something that you drink. But I subtitled this talk, Ways I Alienate Traditional Tea and Coffee Drinkers. And I need to start out with an apology here because typically speaking, traditional tea and coffee drinkers look at the kind of innovation and creation that we promote, and it turns them a little bit of the wrong way, especially because they have that kind of purist vibe to them. So I want to start out very quickly just saying we respect tradition, and we think that you ought to respect tradition as well. And I'll start by saying thank you to the traditionalist tea and coffee drinkers because, especially over the past 20 years, you have increased the desire for good quality coffee and tea. And by good, I mean good in three different senses. I mean good in the sense of taste, which is, of course, preferential. But in the 1980s, as a kid, I remember the coffee and tea that was around. It was primarily Lipton-based tea. It was primarily Folgers-based coffee. I'm almost 40 years old now. And I don't know anybody that still drinks Folgers coffee that is under 40 years old because the specialty coffee industry came in and started really promoting freshly roasted coffee right there in your neighborhood, and started to promote after the kind of Starbucks effect kind of swept over in the 80s and 90s, started promoting different types of roasted coffees, and started to increase the flavor profile. So when we go to events in Denver, we have something like the Grand Coffee Bazaar. Most of the drinkers that come that are below 40 years old are drinking something that's very different. They're drinking very floral and bright coffees compared to the older generation that drinks something that is much darker and more like kind of the Starbucks type of Folgers drink. So you can see that just the specialty coffee trends that now actually Starbucks is looking at specialty coffee roasters and starting to change their marketing to more what the specialty coffee roasters are doing in producing small batch coffee and in also promoting things like small batch cold brew coffee. So you can just see the difference in the effect of specialty roasters. So they've promoted good tea in terms of taste, but it's also good in terms of function. Over the past 15 to 20 years, you have seen an incredible amount of actual scientific-backed research coming out about the health benefits of coffee and tea. And so the more that we see that develop, we've been able to promote the health of coffee and tea, and that's been a lot due to the traditionalists who have been saying these things for the past, actually, if you look at ancient traditions, for the past hundreds, if not thousands of years, especially going back with tea for all the medicinal purposes. Now we've got scientific research to actually back up a lot of those claims. And then finally, I want to say a word about the traditionalists have brought a focus on the ethic of coffee and tea. The sustainability of growing coffee and tea, the focus on the farmers, especially in the coffee world. And so the buying and selling of coffee and tea has benefited both the people who farm, who own the farms, who work the farms. It's benefited you. You get a lot more information about the background of the beverages that you're putting into your mouth thanks to the traditionalists who have brought over that information. So thank you, traditional tea and coffee drinkers, for promoting the enjoyment of good tea and coffee, and we appreciate also the emphasis on the cultural and historical significance of tea and coffee. In most cultures around the rest of the world, tea and coffee, especially tea, play a central role in the traditions of the entire culture. It's central to familial customs, political customs, religious customs, social customs. It is part of the daily life. And that trend is now coming here to the United States as well. You see that trend a little bit more in coffee right now than you do in tea because most Americans drink more coffee than tea, but even that trend on a day-to-day experience is starting to change. And the generation that hates being called millennials, but that we all refer to as millennials, actually drinks coffee or tea just as much as they do coffee on a daily basis. So at this point, I think of my thanks for the traditionalists in the same way I thank my dad. My dad is a great man. He works hard. He's a very, very traditional guy, and I think he's great. But sometimes my dad, just like traditionalists, sometimes gets stuck in that tradition and don't encourage the creation and the innovation that we are trying to promote here as a company. So while we respect tradition, we also try to encourage revolution. And especially in the tea and coffee world, we do this by trying to get you to think differently about tea and coffee. I'm trying to promote the idea of thinking about tea and coffee not only as a beverage. I think we'll continue to think about tea and coffee primarily as beverages, but not only as beverages. I want you to start thinking about tea and coffee in other categories. And one of those other main categories, what we were asked to talk about here today, is to think of them as ingredients. And if you start thinking of the bean and the leaf as ingredients, it expands what you're able to do with those products. Mintel, which is a international research company, released food trends for 2017, most of which involve tea or coffee directly, and they relate to this topic of tradition versus revolution, or in conjunction with revolution. Their first point for this was "In tradition we trust," and so they were promoting this idea that, yes, people like the traditional elements of food, and then they had this caveat, and the caveat was, but they also like pushing the envelope, especially when you look at areas like cold brew coffee. So they're promoting the idea of tradition, but in especially coffee and tea, there's a revolution going on. Power to the plants is their second point. The notion is that we are moving towards more plant-based food. That's what people are enjoying more. And you have two beverages, or the bean and the leaf, plant-based foods. They fit directly into the food trends for 2017. Waste not. The companies like Starbucks are already encouraging the composting of coffee beans that are used. We encourage the same thing with tea leaves. When we do massive brewings of our tea concentrates, for instance, we can compost those brewed tea leaves. So don't waste, reuse those things. Time is of the essence. In their section on the night shift, they talked about the importance of having food and beverages that promote good sleep habits, and then it specifically looks at herbal teas for a little bit. Chamomile is one of the most popular teas. We have one of the biggest herbal tea companies right outside of Denver, up in Boulder, Celestial Seasonings, and their Sleepy Time tea is a staple in our household, and it's primarily chamomile based. So the night shift, the idea here for the food trend is promote food that helps you sleep at night. Chamomile has some agents in it that help us sleep well. And then finally, balancing the scales, health for everyone. I already mentioned the research that's come out for tea and coffee for health benefits, and that area of tea and coffee is continuing to grow in terms of the scientific research. So all of the food trends that Mintel points out for 2017 are related to what we're trying to talk here about today with the tea and coffee. So encouraging revolution, if you notice the picture behind the slide there, this is what I'm trying to encourage you to do. Maria Aristidou paints in coffee. She's one of the few people in the world that does that. That's her medium. So that's the kind of thinking in categories that go beyond thinking of coffee only as a beverage. That's one of her paintings of Einstein, purely done with a paintbrush and a cup of coffee. So if you start thinking of the leaf and bean as ingredients, you start to expand your horizons, and you can see that it's going to be useful in all sorts of dishes. So useful in appetizers. If you look at, you have a soup for an appetizer, if this is something you want to serve, think about a tea-based broth. If you have a salad, think about a tea-based salad. Entrees, we're going to come to a slide here eventually where we see a prime rib encrusted with ground coffee. I think it's ground espresso. You can do all sorts of things with these products if you start to think of them in terms of ingredients. And then, of course, desserts. You're already seeing all sorts of, we've seen coffee ice cream for years, but now we're seeing more tea-based desserts as well, and we'll talk about the trend with matcha here as we go forward with baking. But coffee and tea are good for any type of food during the day, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, not just as a beverage, but actually as ingredients that you're consuming, that you're not just simply drinking. If you think of the tea and coffee as ingredients, you start to look at the health benefits of tea and coffee. Coffee, again, is packed with antioxidants, tea is. Of course, you've got your caffeine content, but especially the herbal teas are good for digestion and all sorts of other benefits involving health. And then finally, we've got tea and coffee flavors for pairing with meals. The amazing thing to me about tea is all tea comes from one leaf. It doesn't matter whether you're drinking an oolong, a black, a green, it all comes from one leaf. And the difference is just simply the different terroirs and the different cultivars of your tea. So tea that comes from China has a certain biography of the culture and the people who produced that tea. But it all comes back down to that same stock. Well, you get seemingly an infinite variety of flavors, though, because you can take that one leaf through those different cultivars, those different terroirs, and then through the blending the different companies all around the world do, and you have an incredible variety of flavors that come from just that one thing. It's the same in coffee. You've got just the coffee cherry, and you've got a huge variety of different now roasts of coffees. You've got coffees from Kenya, Ethiopia, all over the world, really. And you're going to get all sorts of different flavors that pair greatly with all sorts of different foods. And so the more you learn about the flavor profiles of teas and coffee, and you start to expand your understanding of those terroirs and cultivars, you start to see the ability to pair this with different foods as ingredients and not just as beverages. If you look over at the screen here, you see two different wheels. The one on my right, far wheel, is a tea flavor wheel, and then the other one is the coffee flavor wheel. And you can see here that if you want something that is a sweet-based malty tea that you can use as an ingredient, say for like a soup broth or say for a certain type of salad that you're creating, you can find a great Supreme Golden Needle that has an extremely malty taste, and you can use that, versus something that is going to have a little bit of spiciness to it, especially in terms of cinnamon, cardamom, and black pepper. You're looking for something like a chai that you can use, like a chai concentrate, to braise meat with. So in coffee, it's the same type of thing. You have, if you're looking for some brighter coffees, that have a very floral taste to them. You're looking for something that you can maybe boil some meat in that will get some of those floral notes. You're looking for a much lighter roasted bean, and you see your jasmine, your wintergreen. It's amazing the more that you learn about the flavor profiles and you go and experience especially good specialty coffee roasters, you start to be able to pick out all those different flavor notes, and then you can pair them well with the different food that you're trying to create. These wheels are available online, and this whole slideshow will be available for you through the TRA's website with all the links as well. But I'd encourage you to educate yourself a little bit and look up those flavor wheels. So now for the rest of the time, what I want to do is shift focus a little bit. That was just kind of the overview. And now I want to look at the different categories that we have for kind of cutting trends in tea and coffee innovation with especially cooking. And then at the end, we'll return to beverages. Before I got into the tea world, I was a teacher for almost a decade in political science and philosophy. And so I always collaborated with my students. I liked hearing from them and learning from them. You've probably got experience with either baking or maybe cooking or creating cocktails with different tea and coffee products. And so if you have experienced that and if you have some ideas for us, I'm encouraging you as we go through this, just pop out ideas. We'd love to hear them. So please share any tips to avoid, or any tips that you have that we can avoid pitfalls, or any good recipes or new ideas. So I'm happy to have you collaborate with us and give us some ideas here. First category we're going to talk about is baking. Tea and coffee are already very popular in all sorts of baked goods, especially in breads, in cakes, in cookies. They're becoming more popular now in mousses, in ice cream. I just bought some tea or peach tea popsicles from the Fruit Bar brand at the grocery store this past July 4th weekend. So they're expanding their horizon in terms of using tea as an ingredient. In baking, though, the real trend is matcha. And if you're not on the matcha bandwagon yet, maybe you need to be. Matcha is a green tea, and it actually means tea powder. The Chinese word ma is powder, the cha is the Chinese word for tea. So matcha is just simply a tea powder, but there's actually lots of tea powders out there that you can get. And most people are familiar with the matcha that's down there in the bottom corner, that bright green tea powder. The way matcha is produced is the tea is shade grown, which increases the antioxidants and the caffeine content. And they take the leaf and they devein it, which removes a lot of bitterness. Then they stone grind it into a fine green powder. And so it is extremely fresh tasting, very vegetal and earthy tasting. And there's two different grades of matcha. There's a culinary grade, which goes into a lot of baked goods, and there's a ceremonial grade, which most people use for ancient tea ceremonies, but now you can find it in all sorts of coffee houses, especially coffee houses across the U.S. We made ours into a concentrate, and we make some fantastic cocktails along with it. So with matcha and tea now being a tea powder, you can start to expand your ideas about what you can do with that, and you've seen it in a lot of breads. You can go to different bakeries, they'll have a whole matcha section, and what they use matcha for primarily is to start to promote the health benefits of the things that they're baking. Because matcha has so many health benefits, especially its role of antioxidants, they can kind of offset some of maybe the negative health benefits of the cookies that they're baking with the positive health benefits of the matcha. So if you're not familiar with the matcha trend, start to get familiar with that. It's very popular and it's continuing to increase here across the United States. You can get matcha. It's a culinary grade matcha is much cheaper. It's about half the price of like a ceremonial grade matcha here in the U.S. The second category is cooking. Well, let me back up real quick. Has anybody used matcha in the past with cooking? Anybody done that before? Those two guys have. Are you familiar with matcha? Is that a new thing for you? Okay, matcha smoothies are great. Yep, a lot of people do that. They, with concentrates, they put them in smoothies for matcha, or in protein shakes are also great. Anything else? Anybody else use matcha in anything? Have you ever gone into a bakery and seen something that looks as green as like the Incredible Hulk, and you're like, what is that? Chances are that was matcha, something matcha influenced. Yeah. And what? Okay, use it to make cake? Okay, good. So, next category is cooking. This is the slide I was talking about. You can't see it as well, but that's the a nice prime rib that is encrusted in coffee. They've used that as a dry rub for that prime rib. Recently, chefs and cooks have really pushed the envelope on using tea and coffee as ingredients, and I just gave some categories there for you to think about. Different spices and herbs. A lot of teas that you think of as teas, and I'll return to Celestial Seasoning here and say, when you go to tour Celestial Seasonings plants up there in Boulder, one of the first things they tell you is they're not a tea company. They're an herb company, because almost everything that they produce is really herbal based, and that's what they're known for. So those herbs that you have in your tea bags, you can also just take those out of those tea bags and start using them as ingredients, just like you would any other herbs. So peppermint, chamomile, different flowers like hibiscus, those can all be used as ingredients for different food products. Different rubs and marinades. We have people who have taken our tea, they grind it down, and they use it as a rub for a variety of meats. For back to spices, you have like a green tea salt spice that's really fantastic. So again, you can just stone grind your green tea, mix it with some different other spices and use that. Infused creams. My wife likes to infuse creamer for coffee, and so she infuses that with like Earl Grey tea, or a nice hibiscus is good. There's all sorts of dressings out there now that you can infuse with tea. Concentrates are used in broths, in sauces. They're used to braise meat. They're also great for something like a baked oatmeal. We have any type of really liquid that you're using for something like an oatmeal. We have people who take our chai concentrate and they pop it into the oven with some oatmeal overnight, and then when they wake up, they have an awesome baked oatmeal that has a fantastic chai flavor to it. And then finally, butters and spreads. We were interested to see this when we were at the World Tea Expo a couple of weeks ago out in Vegas. There is kind of a movement to start using tea as the basis for butters and spreads, and one of the best one we had was a matcha spread that was basically like a tub of butter that you just dipped your knife into and then just spread over bread, and it was fantastic, and it was also extremely healthy. So with cooking, you can use any of these tea and coffee as ingredients in any of these ways, and there's also, I'm sure, a just variety of other ways. Has anybody here done any cooking with tea or coffee? What have you cooked? Okay, fantastic. So a green tea chicken breast with asparagus. That's fantastic. And I'm assuming you know that pairs well with asparagus. The green tea does, because green tea often has a very vegetal taste to it. Anybody else cooked anything with coffee or tea before? No? What? Oh, it's fantastic. Perfect. Awesome. So a brine chicken and a, what'd you say, it wasn't coffee crusted ribeye here. The next category we're going to talk about is probably the one that is the most popular right now, and that is mixed drinks with tea and coffee. There's been some certain innovations here in the tea and coffee beverage community, as we'll see here on the next slide, that have really helped grow this trend. But as almost all trends, what's really most interesting to me is this is nothing new. This is actually really, really old that's just become popular once again. And in fact, the American cocktail comes from the British cocktail, which the British cocktail comes from actual punch, which comes from India, which was primarily tea-based back in the 1600s. So in India, you had Indian punch that was always had 5 ingredients. Something that was sour, usually a citrus of some kind, something that was sweet, usually sugar, something that was strong, that's your alcohol, something that was weak, and it was almost always tea-based at that point, and then something that was spicy, and so like something, you know, a spice like nutmeg was very popular in Indian punch. Well, the East India Company brought that idea to the British colonies all over the British Empire at the time, and that's how your cocktail started to spread across the British colonies, and then by the 1700s, early 1800s, it started to become more and more popular here in the Americas. And then it kind of lost over time its tea base, and now tea-based cocktails are all the trend, as are coffee-based cocktails. So something that was very old has just become new again. And it's become new again for a good reason. They taste fantastic. You might not think of an Earl Grey infused vodka, But if you go now to most liquor stores, you can find all sorts of different tea-based vodkas that are infused. You can find various cold brews. One of our customers is Corvus Coffee in Denver, Colorado, and they cold brew, and they do their cold brew in whiskey barrels, and then they also mix a little bit of whiskey into their cold brew coffee, and it is absolutely fabulous. I was telling John, right, earlier that a lot of the trend for specialty coffee houses in the Denver area is for the from about 6 in the morning until really about 4 in the afternoon, they're coffee houses, and then they flip and they become cocktail bars from about 4 until 10 or 11 at night. And when they become cocktail bars, they primarily serve coffee and tea-based cocktails for the night. So that trend has been revived for tea cocktails primarily because of the movement towards cold brew tea and coffee, and then also because of the idea of tea concentrates that are becoming more and more popular. How many of you use a tea concentrate other than chai? Okay, so just one out of the whole group, which is interesting or two, because it's one of the things that we did when we moved to Denver was we very quickly saw a craft beer scene. If you've been to Denver, you know the craft beer scene. I think there's well over 300 breweries, and they all seem to be amazingly fantastic and very profitable. So there's 300 craft breweries in Denver, or in Colorado, and we noticed that each one of those has a good variety of craft beers all under the same brand. And we thought, well, we can do the same thing with tea, right? I mean, you've got all sorts of different teas that you can use as the basis for tea concentrates that you can put all under one strong brand. That was a new idea 5 years ago when we started doing that. Since then, you've seen Starbucks now coming out with all sorts of different tea concentrates as well for tea lattes, and they're on the kind of promotion of tea lattes here. And it's not just what they were doing, which was just primarily a green tea latte. They've expanded their line for different tea lattes as well. So you can take those tea concentrates and mix them with any dairy or dairy substitute you like for a tea latte. It's faster than a cup of coffee, brewing up a cup of coffee in the morning. But you can also start to use those as ingredients for all sorts of different foods. And so we've seen an increase in the rise of tea-based soups primarily using these different concentrates as a basis. So the mixers are popularized by cold brew and by concentrates, and then you see it's also become more popular with cocktails because of the infused vodkas, the infused gins, and other alcohol that's out there in liquor stores today. So if you haven't yet had a tea or a coffee cocktail, next time you're out, check the menu out and see if they have any tea or coffee cocktails on there and give them a shot. I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised. Any not had any of those either? You guys have lots of new things to try then as soon as you go away from here. So thinking about tea and coffee as ingredients lets us expand beyond just this is something that I want to drink. It is something that I can cook with, something that I can bake with, but at the end of the day, we still will primarily, hopefully not only anymore, but primarily think about tea and coffee as beverages, which isn't a bad thing. And the industry has been pushing the envelope of creativity in the beverage side of things just as much as the ingredient side of things. So here's some ongoing innovations that you're going to continue to see as we go through 2017, and I think that these are just going to escalate here over the next several years. Cold brew coffee and cold brew tea, almost every company that I know now is doing this. From Dunkin' Donuts to your specialty coffee roasters to, of course, Starbucks, almost everybody's cold brewing. But what not everybody is doing, and I think that is going to become the trend, is they are taking that cold brew and they're kegging it. And if you go to your specialty coffee house, if you haven't had this experience yet, I encourage you to try to find a good specialty coffee house where you can have this, is they take the cold brew, they keg it, and they put it on tap. And usually it's a nitro cold brew, and so it's got an incredible foamy kind of feel to it. It sits really nicely on the palate. It is packed with flavors. So a lot more of the flavors get extracted from the oils from coffee and tea through the cold brew process than they do through the hot brew process. So you're cold brewing that coffee and tea anywhere between 12 to 24 hours, and you're going to have a brand new experience and probably a brand new appreciation for the flavor profiles of different teas and coffees if you drink cold brew tea or coffee, and if you can find it kegged. What we learned was we can do the same thing with tea as what coffee has done, and so we've started to keg our concentrates, and we can keg our iced teas and make them into sparkling teas by adding carbonated or carbonation to them. So that's another, I think, growing trend that you will start to see here as we go forward. Tea concentrates I've mentioned throughout, and coffee concentrates are becoming more and more popular as well. You've got carbonated drinks. A lot of people like just the feel, even if they don't like the sugar content of a soda, like Coke or Pepsi or whatever else, they like the feel of the carbonation on their mouth. Well, now you can do the same thing with tea, and it's a lot more healthy for you. A lot of them don't have any sugar in them whatsoever. It's just your interesting tea blend, or it's your strong tea that has carbonation for it. And in the industry, they call them sparkling teas, but they're very popular. You can buy some of them as ready-to-drink teas as well. Some of the bigger brands are trying to get on this train, and they're trying to get out ahead of it and starting to produce these so you can find them in your grocery stores. Another trend right now is kid-friendly tea and coffee. And you don't really think of coffee necessarily with kids because of the caffeine content. And we get this with people all the time as well. We don't want our kids to have tea because of the caffeine, even though it's generally half the content of a cup of coffee. But a lot of kid-friendly teas are coming out now that are herbal-based teas. And so you'll start to see what used to be juice boxes now are tea boxes for children. And they're based primarily with rooibos, that is a great kind of herb that has a woody taste to it. And that's something that's going to be, I think, more and more popular. You've seen Honest Tea, the brand Honest Tea, who has started to produce an entire children's line. And so I think that they're trying to get those also into schools. And so instead of just seeing the choice of a regular milk or chocolate milk for lunch or water, you're going to see different tea boxes around as well. And then finally, the massive explosion in dairy substitutes has contributed to the rise of the possibility of new tea-based beverages and coffee-based beverages for lattes. So you see in Denver, we do all sorts of events and like quarterly cocktail events. We also do all sorts of events throughout towns for parties and whatever else. And since we have concentrates, people use them for lattes. And it's astounding to me how many different dairy substitutes there are out here. If you haven't been familiar with oat milk yet, that's something to get on your radar because oat milk is extremely popular. It's much more creamy than an almond or a soy. You also have your cashew milk that is becoming more and more popular, and you can buy that along with oat milk now in most grocery stores. Rice milk, hemp milk is very popular as well. And it seems like every time that I'm out with somebody, somebody comes up and says, hey, have you tried this dairy substitute? Most of the time, my answer is, I like milk, so well, that's what I drink. But we do try to experiment as much as we can. And what we find with tea and with coffee is people get used to drinking whatever dairy substitute they have. So if they drink almond milk, that's what they think tastes best in anything. So if they're using that for a latte, that's what or if they're using that with coffee, that's what they're going to use. That's what they think tastes great. So these tea concentrates for coffee and, or these concentrates for coffee and tea can be mixed with usually any dairy or dairy substitute, and that allows the consumers to control the health of their drink. It also allows them to control if they have special dietary needs of their drink, and it expands their opportunities for drinking more and more tea and coffee. So those are some of the actual beverage trends that you're going to see here going forward. Any comments about the tea or cocktail mixers or the beverage department here with ongoing trends? So, I failed to mention kombucha actually. We have not made any cocktails with kombucha yet because we are still working on our kombucha process. Kombucha, for those of you who don't know this, is a fermented tea. And it already has a kind of carbonation to it because of the fermentation process. but it is a tea-based beverage, and it's also packed with probiotics, and so it's considered to be very healthy for you. There are tea kombucha bars that are kind of tap rooms that are popping up all over in cities. Do you have any kombucha bars, tap rooms here in Denver, or in Dallas, do you know? Anybody from Dallas? Anybody have a kombucha bar in your town? Because if not, I'm going to start one and then make a killing. Okay. We have in the Boulder, Denver area, I can think of 5 that we have. So, and they all do pretty well, and it's fantastic because you can go in, again, it's kegged kombucha, and you can just get it on tap, and it's delicious and very nutritious as well. So you can use those in cocktails. We haven't done that yet. That's a good trend going forward as well. Any other comments or ideas about mixers with tea or coffee? Or beverage trends? Any questions at all from you about any of the trends with tea and coffee, either as ingredients or as beverages? None? Alrighty. So last slide here is just different resources. Go home, or maybe even in the next hour or 2 hours while you're here, just Google coffee recipes, or better yet, rather, coffee cooking recipes, because if you just Google coffee recipes, it'll give you mainly beverages. But if you Google like coffee cooking recipes, you will get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recipes. So they're all over the place. For tea, the tea world's actually done a little bit better than the coffee world in terms of using tea for ingredients in cooking. Susan Klein, who writes Tea Foodie, has all sorts of recipes on her blog that are good. Most tea companies that I'm familiar with, ours is not one of them yet because unfortunately our website, any of you who own companies, you know this, our website that was supposed to be done July 1st has now been moved to about August 1st or 15th, somewhere in there, so which will have our recipes tab on there and all the recipes available to you. I was hoping to get it done before this event. Did not happen. But most tea companies do a better job than coffee companies in terms of having a recipes tab. And so 2 of the ones that are local to Colorado up in Boulder area, Teatulia and the Tea Spot, both have great recipes tabs on there. You can go in there and find entrees, desserts, baked goods, whatever you like in terms of using tea as an ingredient. So I left these there for you, and then my contact information is there at the bottom of the slide. So if you do have any questions or you want some ideas for how to continue to push the envelope and continue that revolution in tea and coffee that we're seeing right now, feel free to shoot me an email or send me a text or give me a call. I'll be happy to try to point you in the right direction. Thank you so much for coming and listening here. I hope that you learned something and enjoyed it. And I'm going to be up here at the front just for any of you who want to come up and chat for a little while. Thank you so much.